You can also watch Book TV's coverage of FreedomFest 2011 online at booktv.org. But first, here is Don Luskin on his book I Am John Galt, which profiles people who symbolize characters, both heroes and villains, in Ayn Rand's novels.
One of the secrets of Atlas Shrugged's enduring popularity is that, yes, it describes this nightmare world with these villains like this, but it's also a profoundly inspiring book. It's the best of times and the worst of times. The heroes in it are absolutely inspiring. Who can read that book and not identify with characters like Dagny Taggart and Hank Rearden and Francisco de Cunha and Ragnar Daniscold? It's a very, very inspiring book, and I'm here to tell you that our world, as bleak as it seems, is absolutely populated by those kinds of heroes. Now, like all heroes, some heroes are tragic heroes, like some of the heroes in Atlas Shrugged, in fact. So let's look at some of the heroes of Atlas Shrugged. Henry Rearden, the steel tycoon who invented a revolutionary new metal, Rearden metal, had it taken away from him by the government that was blackmailing him. Ring any bells? How about Bill Gates? Exactly like Henry Rearden, college dropout, created a revolutionary technology that transformed all our lives, extended all our wealth, became the richest man in the world in the process, well-deserved. Then in 1999, using tax dollars that Bill Gates himself had sent to Washington, Washington sent to Bill Gates a lawsuit from the Department of Justice seeking to break up Microsoft on antitrust grounds, which is just a polite way of saying because you succeeded too much. Now, just like Rearden, when that happened, Gates couldn't be bothered to dirty his hands going and hanging out with those yucky people in Washington. I don't blame him. Microsoft was a gigantic company. I think it only had like 2 or 3 lobbyists at that time. Boy, did he learn his lesson. He kind of won the suit. He settled it on fairly favorable terms. But Microsoft is still struggling with the echoes of it. I mean, they're still straightening out their antitrust issues in Europe, for example. But there's another broken man. He stepped down as CEO as soon as the suit was settled. You seen the Microsoft stock price lately? You can draw a little X on the Microsoft stock price where Bill Gates stepped down. That X is way above the current stock price. It hasn't traded there again for 11 years. It's a broken stock because Bill Gates is a broken man. Bill Gates created the world's largest fortune. If he'd stayed at the helm, he could have taken the world's largest fortune and made it even larger. Now he's giving it away. What do we call this? Doctors call this Stockholm Syndrome, when you identify with your kidnappers. Our culture vilified Bill Gates for making money. Now we love him because he's giving away money. That's sending a wrong message to our children. So what's the lesson of Bill Gates? There's a light lesson and a dark lesson. The light lesson is you can drop out of school and become the richest man in the world. And by the way, the spillover effect to all of us, people rail about income inequality. Let me tell you the good side of it about income inequality. When there is a guy as rich as Bill Gates, that sets the bar. That means that something is possible for everybody that wasn't possible until he proved it could be done. It was like when the first guy who broke the 4-minute mile. Thank you, Bill Gates, for showing what can be done. It can still happen in America. The other lesson of Bill Gates is watch your back. Don't make the mistake of ignoring Washington. Let me switch to the Fountainhead for a minute and talk about a hero from the Fountainhead. He happens to be my favorite character from the whole Ayn Rand canon. It is Howard Roark, the rebellious architect, the ultimate individual, I think one of the most fascinating characters in all of literature. From page 1 to page 1,000, or however long that book is, he's the only major hero in the history of literature who undergoes absolutely no transformation during the book. He's presented as perfect on page 1 and perfect on the last page. And what is it that's perfect about him? He is an absolute individual. And every step he makes, every success he has, every trial he faces, is faced with absolute, utter integrity in his individualism and a sheer joy in his work. In our world, that man is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs dropped out of college. He's an orphan, guy who just came out of nowhere, just like Howard Roark. Think what he accomplished simply because he loves it. He's just obsessed with this stuff. There's like toys for him to play with, a canvas for him to paint on. When he founded Apple Computer, he completely transformed the computer industry from a command and control mainframe model to an individual empowerment desktop model. He made that happen. A few years later, he bought an obscure little digital rendering company on a fire sale when George Lucas needed to get rid of it, called Pixar. He had this idea that this could be used to create full-length animated movies. He thought that would be pretty cool. He'd like to see a movie like that. So he found this guy named John Lasseter, and they worked together on a movie that would eventually be called Toy Story. They spent so many years on it, and so much of Steve Jobs' money, he came near to personal bankruptcy funding it. They almost discontinued Toy Story at the last minute. Finally, he did a Hail Mary pass and did a deal with Disney to get it distributed. Toy Story is now one of the top 10 biggest grossing movies of all time. It's had 2 sequels, which are also on the top 10 list of biggest grossing movies of all time. And he did it not to make money, he just thought it was cool. I remember meeting Steve Jobs in the kiddie pool in a resort in Hawaii years back when we both had young children. And I went with my daughter into the pool, and Steve Jobs is in there. Of course, I recognize him. He sticks out his hand, and he says, "Hi, my name's Steve. I make movies. What do you do?" Look, man, the secret is just love your work. What else has he done? He created iTunes and the iPod. That's his third industry. So he completely transformed computers, completely transforms movies. Then he completely transforms music. And he's not done. Then he creates the iPhone and completely transforms telephony. And now he's created the iPad and gone back and re-transformed the first industry he transformed, computing. So don't tell me there aren't heroes in this world. You know, on that panel yesterday, I was the only optimist in the room. Well, look, you can't meet Steve Jobs and not be optimistic. That's what's possible. I know there are a lot of problems in this world, but there are a lot of solutions too. Another great Silicon Valley figure is a man named T.J. Rogers. He's the CEO of Cypress Semiconductor. I think he's been a FreedomFest guest in the past. I don't think he's here this year. If you own a cell phone, crack it open, look at all those little miracles inside it. Quite a few of them probably come from Cypress Semiconductor. They're a leader in that field. T.J. Rogers is like the character in Atlas Shrugged, Francisco d'Anconia. Remember, d'Anconia showed up in critical scenes in Atlas Shrugged whenever the main heroes were having a moment of doubt, needed a little moral clarity. He would show up to tell them what's what. One of the most often quoted passages in all of Ayn Rand is Francisco's famous speech about the nobility of money, where he's at a cocktail party and some heiress says money is the root of all evil. And he then goes on for 20 pages proving that the money is the root of all good. T.J. Rogers is that kind of guy. He's completely politically incorrect. He's a CEO of a major company who says things that CEOs aren't supposed to get away with, and he does it by having absolute moral clarity. So I'm going to quote some TJ for you. Like many CEOs, he's constantly under assault by politically correct people trying to get them to have more gender diversity, more religious diversity, more racial diversity on their boards and in their workforce. A couple years back, a Franciscan nun named Mary Gormley, Sister Gormley, attacked Cypress Semiconductor, insisting that they diversify their board more for gender and race. TJ responded in the Wall Street Journal, "Choosing a board of directors based on race and gender is a lousy way to run a company. Cypress will never do it. Furthermore, we will never be pressured into it because bowing to well-meaning special interest groups is an immoral way to run a company, given all the people it would hurt. We simply cannot allow arbitrary rules to be forced on us by organizations that lack business expertise. I would rather be labeled as a person who is unkind to religious groups than as a coward who harms his employees and investors by mindlessly following high-sounding but false standards of right and wrong." And he survived. In 1999, Jesse Jackson came to Silicon Valley. It was part of this program he had at that time where he went to Wall Street and declared Wall Street to be racist. Then he went to Detroit and declared the automobile industry to be racist. Then he came to Silicon Valley and declared technology to be racist. TJ, whose company at that time had 35% minority employees, every one of whom was a shareholder, and 44% of whose executive VPs were minorities, gave a quote to one news station, and I say, quote unquote, "Jesse Jackson reminds me of a seagull. He flies in, craps all over everything, and then flies out." Okay, lesson here is simple. Just believe it. Have the courage of your conviction. Just say it. If they sense weakness, they'll kill you. Don't show any weakness. Just believe what you believe. So these heroes I've been talking about are businessmen. And a lot of people misread Atlas Shrugged to say that what it's really telling you is that all businessmen are good and all government people are evil. Well, go back and read Atlas Shrugged. Who's the main villain of Atlas Shrugged? The main villain of Atlas Shrugged is a businessman. It's James Taggart, the president of Taggart Transcontinental. The great tension that runs throughout the book is the conflict between James Taggart, the bad executive, and his sister, Dagny Taggart, the good railroad executive. All of the political machinations executed by Wesley Mooch and all the other government parasites in Atlas Shrugged are because James Taggart is pulling the strings with his own crony capitalist games. So in our book, when we were looking for an analogy to James Taggart, we happened on a fellow named Angelo Mozillo. Is that a name that's familiar to anybody? He is the founder and former CEO of a company, I guess we should call it the former company, Countrywide Financial. Countrywide Financial was the poster child for everything you could possibly do wrong in subprime lending. After Mozillo secretly sold his stock in Countrywide in 2007, the same week he gave a shareholder presentation saying that everything was fine. From that point, 7 months later, the company lost 80% of its value, at which point it was acquired by Bank of America, and I'm sure they thought they were really getting quite a bargain. Well, it turned out there was no bargain big enough to buy Countrywide Financial. Not only did it carry all kinds of unknown liabilities, but Bank of America is still paying. 2 weeks ago, they paid $8.7 billion to settle lawsuits and regulatory complaints about the fraudulent documentation of Countrywide mortgages. Let me tell you just how fraudulent some of these mortgages were, just for anybody who thinks that all business is noble. It's not. A lot of business is. Look, some government is. A lot of business isn't. Countrywide lent $339,000 to a part-time Chicago housekeeper who made $200 a week. $339,000, $200 a week. After receiving the mortgage, she went home to Poland, never made a single payment. $350,000 to an illiterate California dairy worker making $1,100 a month. $398,000 to a woman unemployed since 1988. Now, why would anybody lend money to people like that? It is simple. Because you make a fee when you write the mortgage, then the actual mortgage itself gets transferred to all of us through government-sponsored organizations like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Thus, the connection between Angelo Mozillo and Barney Frank, the unholy alliance of corporations and government. That's what Ayn Rand opposed. That's what Atlas Shrugged was about. That's when they got you, when corrupt companies and corrupt government get together.